Smoke curled low across the earth, a gray tide swallowing shapes and silencing colors. It moved like something alive, twisting in the light of burning wreckage, rising in thin veils that clung to the lungs and choked the sky. For most, the instinct was simple: drop low, disappear, become smaller than the chaos. But not her. Through the haze, her outline remained upright, steady, almost defiant. The air clawed at her throat, ash biting her eyes, yet she refused to bend. The others glanced up between frantic bursts of fire, their bodies pressed into the dirt, confusion flickering when they caught her figure unmoving. A shadow in the storm, a monument where none should stand. Why didn't she fall like the rest? Why hadn't fear forced her to the ground? The answer wasn't in the smoke. It wasn't even on that field. The answer had been written long before, in moments no one else had seen. It lived in memories that pressed against her chest like an old wound, a silence heavier than the rifle slung against her shoulder. But tonight, in the storm of fire and doubt, that silence would finally begin to speak. Hours earlier, the field had been nothing but a point on the map, a red circle, a note about likely resistance, and a time scribbled across the top. The briefing room had smelled of stale coffee and dust, papers shuffling under restless hands, the air thick with fatigue and unspoken fear. She had stood at the edge of the table, eyes scanning the grid lines, lips pressed into a firm line. The men filled the space with noise, debating routes, second-guessing intel, building contingency plans in clipped, rehearsed tones. And then she had spoken, just once. "If you flank from the ridge, you'll leave the southern path exposed." Clear, direct, without hesitation. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of dismissal. Someone cleared his throat. Another tapped his pen. A captain shifted the map closer to his side, eyes sliding past her as though the air itself had spoken. She stood there steady, though a familiar sting spread in her chest. That old, quiet ache she had come to know too well, the feeling of being unseen. Why was everyone ignoring her? The answer wasn't complicated. Not really. To them, her silence was a weakness. Her small frame, her calm voice, her refusal to fight for space at the table, all of it read as insignificance. They wanted louder voices, harder fists, bigger bodies. She didn't fit the image they carried in their heads. But what they didn't understand was that silence had been her training ground. Silence had been her survival. She remembered the nights after her brother's death. The house too quiet. Her mother staring at a chair that would never again be filled. Neighbors speaking in hushed tones as if loudness might break what was already shattered. And she had sat alone, back pressed to her bedroom wall, breathing through tears she refused to let fall. Silence was the only thing that held her together then. Her brother had been a soldier too. Taller, louder, quick with a joke when she needed it most. He had carried her on his shoulders when the world felt too heavy, promised her again and again that he'd never let her face it alone. But war does not care for promises. His voice had been cut short by static, his name swallowed by a valley she would never forget. Now, every mission that brought her closer to that valley carried his ghost in its shadows. And tonight, that very valley awaited them. The convoy rolled out at dusk, engines humming low as the landscape bled into silhouettes. She sat in the back, helmet tilted down, rifle resting across her knees. Around her, the others filled the silence with fragments of home. One man pulled out a photograph of a girl, no more than 6, blonde curls bouncing in frozen laughter. "She'll be taller than me by the time I get back," he said with a half-smile, though his eyes didn't match the curve of his lips. Another complained about rations, how the taste of MREs clung to his tongue no matter how much water he drank. Someone else countered with a story about real food back home: smoked ribs, buttered cornbread, hot coffee on a winter morning. The laughter that followed felt fragile, like glass against steel. She listened. She always listened. Their words folded into her silence like prayers pressed into pages, each one a reminder of what they carried inside. But she said nothing, not about the mission, not about her brother, not about the fact that she knew this ground too well, because there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. The valley stretched wide, moonlight spilling across ridges like a silver flood. She felt it before she saw it, the weight of memory pressing against her ribs, the echo of static that had once cut through her earpiece in this very place. She remembered the panic in her brother's last words, a call for help swallowed too soon. Her breath caught in her chest. No one noticed. Engines cut, boots hit dirt. The air smelled of stone and dust, the kind that dries your throat before fear ever has the chance. The squad spread, moving into position. Radios whispered. Then, the first shot. It cracked the air like glass breaking in a cathedral. Then another. Then three more. Panic spread faster than the smoke blooming from grenades tossed for cover. Men dove into the dirt, rifles raised toward unseen shadows. Voices tangled over comms, orders lost in fear. And she didn't move. Her boots stayed planted in the dirt, body upright against the storm. Through the veil of smoke, her figure looked wrong. To the soldiers crawling on their bellies, she looked like a ghost, a shape refusing to break, a monument against the chaos. "Get down," someone shouted, but she didn't hear it, or maybe she chose not to. Her breath slowed, her mind counted. Shots, angles, distance. She didn't flinch when the dirt near her boots spat upward. She didn't fold when the wind carried the scent of burning cloth. Instead, she let the stillness settle into her bones. Because she remembered what had happened the last time she bent. The last time she folded into fear, silence had betrayed her. It had swallowed her brother's voice before she could reach him. Not tonight. If she stood, maybe she could hold onto the silence differently, not as a curse, but as a weapon. The firefight dragged on. Every second stretched into an hour. Voices cracked, orders snapped, the air thick with dust and gunpowder. She moved only when she had to, shifting to steady another, guiding a rifle, pressing a hand against a panicked shoulder. Her silence became something they leaned on without realizing. At one point, the youngest in the group, a private barely old enough to grow a full beard, broke. His rifle trembled in his hands, breath ragged, eyes wide. I can't do this," he whispered, voice breaking under the weight of terror. She placed her hand on his shoulder. No words, just presence, just silence. And in that silence he steadied. What none of them saw was the war raging inside her. Every calm breath she gave him cost her one more memory of her brother. Every time she steadied someone else, she felt the ground pulling her back into the moment she couldn't forget, the valley, the static, the voice fading too soon. She carried her brother's ghost in her silence, and tonight she carried the weight of them all. When the smoke finally began to thin, dawn was already pressing its pale light against the horizon. The firefight had slowed, but the silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. Men counted names. Too many missing. Too many still. She didn't cry. She never cried. Instead, she walked alone to the ridge, the same ridge she had warned about. And there, half buried in the dirt, she found it, an insignia, faded, weathered, scarred by sun and stone. Her brother. She held it in her hand, the world narrowing to the weight of that small piece of cloth. For the first time in years, her silence cracked, not into sobs, not into words, but into understanding. He hadn't been betrayed by silence. He had been betrayed by those who refused to listen. And maybe now, in the smoke and the dawn, her silence had rewritten what his could not. She stood there until the sun rose fully, light cutting through the smoke, her figure still tall against the field. And for the first time, the others looked at her not as someone too quiet, too fragile, too small. They looked at her and saw strength carved out of silence. And though no report would ever carry her name, though no medal would ever rest against her chest, history would remember. Because sometimes, destiny isn't rewritten by words. It's rewritten by the figure that refuses to fall, by the silence that refuses to break. And when silence rewrites destiny, It leaves an echo louder than any war cry. Why didn't she speak when they regrouped at dawn? The others were exhausted, their shoulders sagging, eyes hollowed by the weight of names that would never answer again. Dust clung to their uniforms, blood darkened the sleeves of the medic who moved among them. Yet in the middle of it all she stood a little apart, quiet as always. She had seen the looks, some searching, some uncertain. After the firefight, after her refusal to fall, they no longer dismissed her so easily. But respect is not given in words out here. It lingers in glances, in silence thicker than smoke. The captain counted the wounded aloud, his voice clipped, mechanical. He didn't thank her. He didn't ask why she hadn't broken like the rest. But when his eyes met hers for a fleeting second, something unspoken passed between them. A recognition, fragile and unfinished. She turned away before it could root too deeply. Her hand still clenched the insignia she had found, edges frayed, the cloth damp with morning dew. She had slipped it into her pocket when no one was watching, pressing it against her thigh like a secret talisman. They would never know what it meant. They didn't need to. This valley was hers in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. But what haunted her most wasn't the firefight. It was what came next. The return to base was heavy, the convoy crawling back along broken dirt paths under the wash of morning light. Inside the vehicle, the air was thick with silence. Not her silence, but the silence of grief, the silence of men replaying the last few hours again and again behind their eyes. A few muttered words broke through. "I should have covered him. He was right there, right there. It doesn't make sense." She kept her gaze forward, rifle resting across her knees, body still as stone. She knew those words. She had spoken them once herself, years ago. "I should have been there. It doesn't make sense." They never faded. They etched themselves deeper with time until silence became the only way to carry them. The young private she had steadied during the fight sat beside her. His breathing was calmer now, though his hand still trembled faintly on his lap. He kept glancing at her, as if waiting for something, words, maybe, or acknowledgement. She didn't offer any. Not because she didn't care, but because she knew too well how little words did in moments like these. Still, when their eyes finally met, she gave the smallest nod, just enough. His shoulders loosened just a little. That was enough. Back at base, the debrief was as clinical as always. Losses recorded, routes analyzed, mistakes noted in tones meant to sound neutral but heavy with judgment. She sat near the back, helmet resting on her knees, listening as the officers dissected every move, every choice. The ridge, the southern path, the ambush. Her earlier warning was never mentioned. She watched the captain as he spoke, his jaw tight, his words measured. When he paused to drink, his eyes flickered to her again. A second too long, a hesitation no one else noticed. But still, silence swallowed her. It didn't matter. She wasn't here to be acknowledged, not by them. She was here because of him, because her brother's name still echoed in this valley, still bled through her dreams, still carved itself into her silence with every breath. She hadn't told anyone, and she didn't plan to. This mission wasn't theirs to understand. It was hers. Night fell again, thick and heavy, pressing against the walls of the barracks. Soldiers slept restlessly, some tossing, some murmuring names into the dark. She lay awake, her body still, her hand curled around the insignia hidden beneath her pillow. Why couldn't she tell them? Why did the words always stop in her throat? She remembered the day she had enlisted, her mother's silence at the kitchen table, the untouched cup of coffee cooling between them. Her mother had already buried one child. The weight in her eyes said she couldn't bear to lose another. But what choice had there been? Silence doesn't forgive. Silence demands repayment. And the only way to face it was to walk into the same fire that had taken him. Now, as the barracks breathed with the restless sleep of the living, she closed her eyes and listened. To the hum of the generators, to the soft shuffle of boots outside, to the silence that had become her only language. And in that silence, her brother's voice returned, fragmented, broken by static, but sharp enough to cut. "Stay with me. Don't leave me." She whispered into the dark, "I didn't." The next day brought new orders, a patrol deeper into the valley, a search for remnants of the enemy, for answers to how the ambush had formed. The squad groaned, weariness etched into their faces. She didn't flinch. She wanted it, needed it. The private, the same one she had steadied, walked beside her as they prepared. He adjusted his rifle strap nervously. "You ever get scared out there?" he asked, voice low, as if afraid of being overheard. She looked at him, really looked for the first time. His eyes were young, too young for the things he had already seen. She could have lied, could have given him the answer he wanted. Instead, she gave him the truth. "Every time." He blinked, surprised. "But you don't show it." "That's not the same as not feeling it," she said. He nodded slowly, absorbing her words as if they were heavier than they seemed. Then he asked no more. That was enough. The patrol carved through the valley in the thin light of dawn. Dust rose with every step, the air dry enough to crack lips, to sting eyes. Birds scattered from ridges, their cries sharp against the stillness. Every rock, every shadow, every whisper of wind felt like a threat. She kept her eyes scanning, body relaxed but alert, silence steadying her like armor. At one point, the squad paused by an abandoned outpost, walls crumbling, bullet holes marking its bones. The medic ran his hand across the wood, muttering about how long it had been here, how many lives had passed through it. The private leaned against the doorway, eyes darting nervously into the shadows. She stepped inside. The smell of old smoke lingered, faint but unmistakable. Her boots echoed against the hollow floor. And then she saw it etched into the wood near the corner, faint but still clear. Initials. Her brother. Her breath caught. She reached out, fingertips tracing the letters. Faded, nearly lost to time, but is all the same. He had been here. The squad called her name from outside. She didn't answer. For a moment she let the silence hold her, let the weight of memory press fully against her chest. Her throat tightened, but no tears came. She hadn't cried in years. She didn't know if she remembered how. When she finally stepped back into the light, the private noticed something in her eyes. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. The day stretched, the patrol pressing deeper, the weight of the valley pressing harder. At dusk, they set camp among the rocks, firelight flickering against tired faces. Men shared stories again, softer this time, as if afraid of disturbing the shadows. The private sat near her, quiet, eyes on the flames. After a long silence, he spoke. "You're different than the others." She raised a brow but said nothing. "You don't fill the space with noise. You just hold it like it belongs to you." She didn't answer, but inside she felt something shift, a small crack in the silence she had carried for so long. Maybe he was right. Maybe silence wasn't just the weight of loss. Maybe it was something more. That night, as she lay under the stars, the insignia pressed to her chest, she thought of her brother again. Thought of the promises broken, of the silence that had swallowed him whole. And she wondered, for the first time, if silence could be more than grief, if it could be strength, if it could rewrite destiny. The valley was far from finished with her, and she was far from finished with it. The night pressed against the outpost like a living thing, thick and unrelenting. Darkness in this part of the valley was not empty, it carried whispers, the scrape of stone shifting beneath hidden steps, the brittle snap of branches under unseen weight. To most it was suffocating, a void filled with threat. But for her, silence had become a language, one she had been forced to learn, one she wielded with precision. The others in the unit fidgeted restlessly as the hours stretched. Private Carden exhaled too loudly, drawing a sharp look from Sergeant Hale. Torres checked his rifle a third time, pretending not to notice that his hands trembled. Even Hale, so steadfast, tapped his boot against the stone floor, the rhythm betraying unease. She sat apart, her back to the cold wall, her rifle resting across her lap. Her frame looked fragile in the dim glow of a single flickering lantern, shoulders drawn in, cheekbones hollowed by fatigue, eyes shadowed by the weight of all she carried. To the untrained eye, she was just a girl too delicate for war, too quiet for command. But the truth lay not in what she showed, but in what she withheld. Every breath she measured, every sound catalogued, every vibration mapped against memory. She could feel where the ground shifted outside the walls, the faintest tremor hinting at boots in the dust. She could hear the unnatural pause in the crickets' song, the subtle silence of birds driven from the trees. The world itself betrayed intruders, and she was listening. Hale broke the quiet. His voice was low, gravel ground against steel. "They're out there testing us, waiting." No one argued. Carden swallowed, his voice tight. "So what's the play, Sergeant? Do we wait till they bleed us dry, or we trust the walls?" Torres cut in. "The command said hold the outpost. That's what we're doing." The words fell flat. They all knew the walls wouldn't hold if the enemy pressed hard. And worse, they knew reinforcements weren't coming. They were alone, cut off by terrain and silence from command. All eyes drifted, as if by some unspoken instinct, to her. She didn't flinch beneath their gaze, didn't move. She only kept her eyes fixed on the dark beyond the window slit, as though the night itself had offered her secrets. It was Hale who finally spoke, his tone cautious, almost reluctant. "You hear something, don't you?" Her gaze slid to him, calm and unreadable. A long moment passed before she nodded. "They're probing the east side," she said quietly. Her voice carried no tremor, no doubt. "2 squads at least. The ground tells me they're setting equipment. They'll cut our lines before dawn." Torres scoffed. "What, you can feel the dirt moving, that's your proof?" Her eyes didn't leave him. "The crickets stopped singing 15 minutes ago on that side. They haven't started again." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Carden shifted uncomfortably. Hale studied her with that sharp, assessing stare of his. Finally he asked, "What do you suggest?" It was a question that should never have been asked of her, not officially. She wasn't ranked high enough, wasn't part of the inner circle of decision. But her silence carried weight, and her words, when they came, did not waver. "We let them think we're blind. Hold the lantern steady, make no sound of preparation. When they breach, they'll expect panic. That's when we cut them down." Torres shook his head, muttering, "Madness, sitting ducks." But Hale didn't look away from her. He saw something in her composure, something that silenced his doubt. After a long pause, he nodded. "Do as she says." The hours crawled. They sat in suffocating stillness, the lantern casting long, thin shadows across the stone walls. Sweat gathered at temples. Fingers twitched against rifle triggers. Even Torres, for all his doubt, obeyed. She sat unmoving, her face tilted slightly as though the night whispered directly to her. Her heart beat steady, though a storm churned beneath her ribs. She remembered another night, another silence, when her brother had pressed a hand to her shoulder and whispered, "Don't speak. Just feel. The earth tells you everything you need to know." He hadn't survived that mission. His name had been left off the report, but his lessons lived in her bones, guiding her now. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then faint, so faint no one else stirred, she heard it, a scrape, a weight against stone, the measured rhythm of boots closing in. Her eyes flicked to Hale. No words passed between them. He nodded once. She raised her hand, a single finger cutting the air. "Wait." The enemy breached the east wall with the confidence of predators closing on wounded prey. Their shadows spilled across the courtyard, rifles raised, eyes sharp for panic. But what they found was silence. She fired first. A single shot, precise, breaking the stillness like lightning through storm clouds. The enemy stumbled. The unit surged into motion, each soldier finding strength in her unshakable calm. Carden's trembling hands steadied. Tor's doubt burned away in the fire of necessity. Hale roared orders, his voice carrying the weight of command. But it was her silence that bound them, her quiet certainty that gave their chaos shape. The courtyard erupted in fire and thunder, but she moved through it untouched, her fragile frame bending, weaving, striking with precision. Her rifle cracked like punctuation marks in a story she had written long before the first enemy set foot on their ground. When it ended, when smoke and silence returned to the night, the outpost still stood. The unit breathed hard, eyes wide, bodies trembling with adrenaline. Tor stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. His lips parted, but no words came. Hale approached, his gaze steady. He didn't speak at first, just studied her, the dust on her cheek, the calm in her eyes. "You carried us," he said finally, his voice low, almost reverent. She said nothing, only lowered her rifle, exhaled, and let the night settle again around her shoulders. Because this was her burden, to bear what others could not, to hold the silence that others feared, to be the stillness in the storm. And though her name might never appear on reports, though history might never etch her sacrifice in ink, the truth would remain in the hearts of those who fought beside her. Her silence had saved them, and it was only the beginning. The first light of dawn crept over the jagged ridges, bleeding gold into the valley where shadows still clung like ghosts. Smoke lingered above the outpost, drifting in slow curls from the shattered eastern wall. The smell of gunpowder and scorched stone clung to the air, a reminder of how close death had pressed against them through the long night. Inside the walls, the survivors moved like figures carved from exhaustion. Hale barked orders, but his voice carried less fire now, worn thin by the weight of too many choices. Carden dragged fallen sandbags into place with trembling arms. Tors, silent at last, knelt near the breach, collecting the spent casings one by one as though order could somehow erase what they had endured. And she stood apart. Her rifle slung across her chest, her hair tangled with dust, her frame thinner in the light of morning than it had seemed beneath the shadows of night. The lantern glow had hidden the hollows of her cheeks, the faint tremor of fatigue in her hands. Dawn revealed her frailty in brutal detail, and yet it revealed something else too, the unwavering calm in her eyes. Hale approached, his boots crunching softly against the debris. He paused a step away, studying her as though he were still trying to unravel the contradiction of her. "You didn't sleep," he said. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the sunlight touched the mountains. "Neither did you." A faint smile ghosted across his lips, bitter and fleeting. "Fair." He exhaled, then lowered his voice as though admitting something difficult. "We'd have been dead without you." She turned at last, her eyes meeting his. No pride, no triumph lived there, only quiet acceptance. "We're alive because we listened to what the silence was already telling us." Hale studied her a moment longer before shaking his head. "You and your silence, I don't know how you do it." Neither did she, not truly. She only knew that silence had raised her, forged her, burned itself into her skin. Her brother's lessons lived in every stillness she carried. His absence echoed in every quiet she endured. By mid-morning, the unit gathered in the courtyard to take stock. Their supplies had dwindled, food for 3 days at most, ammunition stretched thin, medical kits nearly empty. Worse, the outpost's communications tower had been severed in the night. They were alone, cut off, their survival dependent on their own resolve. Carden voiced the thought none wanted to speak. "If they come again tonight, we won't hold." The words sank heavy. Tors clenched his fists but didn't argue. Even Hale fell silent. She stepped forward then, her voice calm, level. "They will come again." All eyes turned to her, the fragile girl who had become their anchor. "They're not done," she continued. "Last night was testing, today they'll plan, tonight they'll break us if we're unprepared." Hale frowned. "And you suggest?" She paused, her eyes sweeping the battered walls, the faces etched with exhaustion. Then softly, "We stop waiting for them to choose the time." The silence after her words was thick. Carden blinked, Tors frowned, Hale's brow furrowed. "You mean strike?" he asked. She nodded once. "Yes, before dusk, while they rebuild, before they gather strength." Tors scoffed. You want us to march into their teeth, with what ammo, with what food? Her gaze turned on him, not sharp, not angry, but steady enough to cut through his doubt. With what we have, with silence, with the ground, with each other. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of her conviction settled into the courtyard like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through them all. Hale was the first to nod. She's right. Waiting means dying on their terms. Moving means maybe living. Carden swallowed pale. Or dying faster. Or dying louder, Tors muttered. She shook her head. No, dying silent and making them fear the quiet. They prepared as the sun climbed higher. The work was methodical, stripped of wasted movement. Ammunition was rationed, blades sharpened, maps drawn in the dust of the courtyard floor. She moved among them, not commanding, not ordering, just guiding with presence. She reminded Carden to steady his hands, taught Tors where to step to avoid breaking branches in the brush, showed Hale where the valley's curves swallowed sound. It was strange how they followed her. She had no rank, no insignia, no authority but her silence. Yet in her stillness they found discipline. In her calm they found belief. By afternoon the plan was set. They would strike at dusk, when the enemy's camp stirred with routine. They would not charge blindly but weave through the terrain like shadows, each step measured, each breath counted. She would lead. As the sun bled toward the horizon, painting the valley in amber fire, the unit slipped from the outpost. The silence outside was heavier now, pregnant with threat. She moved first, her fragile frame cutting through brush without sound. Behind her the others followed, mimicking her stillness, trusting her senses. Every sound became a map to her, every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind. Her brother's voice echoed in memory. The world speaks to you if you let it. Stop trying to command it. Listen. She listened. The enemy camp came into view just as the last light drained from the sky. Shadows stretched long across tents and weapon racks. Guards paced lazily, rifles slung without vigilance. They thought the outpost broken, thought the survivors too weary to fight. They were wrong. With a raised hand, she stilled her unit. They crouched in the undergrowth, breaths held, rifles ready. Her eyes swept the camp, noting the weaknesses, the blind spots. Then, with a single gesture, she sent them forward. The strike was not thunderous, it was not loud. It was silence made sharp. They slipped through the camp like ghosts, blades and suppressed rifles cutting without sound. Panic spread among the enemy as soldiers collapsed without knowing from where death had come. By the time alarm cries rang, the camp was already unraveling. She moved at the center, her rifle a whisper of death, her calm a tether binding her unit together. Hale fought like fire at her side, Tors struck with ferocity, Carden's trembling stilled into precision. The enemy fired wildly into the night, but silence itself betrayed them. Every careless shout, every panicked footfall marked them, and she listened, guiding her unit with gestures more powerful than any command. Minutes felt like hours, the air filled with smoke, dust, the acrid sting of fear, and then sudden stillness. The camp broke, enemy soldiers scattering into the dark, their unity shattered. Her unit stood among the wreckage, battered, bruised, but alive. They had struck first, and they had won. When they returned to the outpost under a bruised sky, no one doubted her anymore. Not Tors, who watched her with something like respect. Not Carden, who followed her with eyes wide as if she were something more than human. Not even Hale, who had carried command longer than anyone, but now shared it with her willingly. She did not smile, did not revel. She only sat by the courtyard wall, rifle resting across her knees, her breath slow, her gaze distant. Because she knew this was not the end. The enemy would return, stronger, hungrier. The silence she carried would be tested again. And though her frame was fragile, though doubt still gnawed at the edges of her own soul, she bore the weight in silence. Because if she did not, no one else could. And that was her burden. Why did her hands still tremble when the valley itself had gone quiet? The question clung to her as dawn broke again, pale and thin, spilling through the cracks in the outpost walls. The night raid had left its scars, broken tents smoldering, tracks carved into the dirt where enemies had fled. They had struck first and they had won. But victory had not lifted the weight from her chest. If anything, it had deepened it. She sat alone against the cold stone, her rifle balanced across her knees. Her fingers brushed the weapon absently, tracing the grooves worn into its stock. The others were scattered nearby, Hale checking defenses, Carden bandaging his blistered palms, Tors packing like a caged animal trying to shake the memory of silence turned deadly. And yet, despite the exhaustion binding them all, none dared speak of leaving her out of the circle anymore. By midday, a fragile rhythm returned. They cleaned weapons, repacked supplies, patched holes in their defenses with anything salvageable. Hale called for a tally of ammunition. The answer was grim. 2 full magazines per man, 3 for her. The words landed heavier than stone. She didn't flinch. Tors was the first to say it. If they come back with force, this outpost is nothing but a coffin. Hale bristled. So we abandon it, run like cowards. Tors snapped back, his voice hoarse. You call it cowardice, I call it survival. We've been cut off for days. No comms, no resupply. How long before command even remembers we exist? No one answered. The silence stretched sharp as glass. Then she spoke, her tone low, even. Running means giving them what they wanted. This valley, this ground. If they take it, others die. If we hold it, even in silence, it matters. Tors stared at her, teeth clenched. You think your silence can hold a valley? Her eyes flicked up, steady, unshaken. It already did. The words cut deeper than any weapon. Tors had no reply. That night she climbed the northern ridge alone. The others had urged her to rest, but her body refused. Fatigue weighed her steps, yet something stronger pulled her higher. The wind carried whispers across the rock, faint and cold. From the crest, she saw the valley spread below, shadows shifting, enemy torches flickering at the far edges. They were gathering. She closed her eyes and listened. The silence wasn't empty. It was alive, layered, the chirp of night insects, the distant howl of something wild, the faint hum of enemy engines, each thread wove into a tapestry only she seemed to hear. And beneath it all, a memory, her brother's voice. Silence isn't absence, it's direction. It tells you what to hold on to when everything else falls apart. Her chest tightened. He had been younger than Hale when he fell, braver than Tors, sharper than Carden. He had carried silence like a shield, and she had watched it break the day they lowered him into the earth. Every mission since had been for him. Every silence endured had been his echo. And still she carried it, though her own body threatened to collapse beneath the weight. By the time she returned to the outpost, the campfires had dimmed and her unit waited. Hale approached, sensing something in her expression. They're moving, he asked. She nodded. They'll strike before dawn. His jaw tightened. Then so will we. But she shook her head. Not this time. This time we hold. No more chasing shadows, they'll come for us, and we make them regret it. Tors muttered under his breath. We barely made it through last time. Carden, quiet until now, spoke up. His voice wavered but held firm. She hasn't been wrong yet. It silenced Tors, it silenced them all. And so the decision was made. The hours before dawn stretched endlessly. They set their traps, reinforced the breaches, carved firing lines into the dirt. Hale whispered instructions, but it was her movements they mirrored, her calm, her patience. Inside, she was not calm. Every muscle burned, every breath caught. Her fragile frame screamed for rest, but she pushed it down. She couldn't falter, not when they had finally begun to believe in her silence. When the first crack of gunfire split the night, no one flinched. They were ready. The enemy came with fire and fury this time. Mortars thudded against the outer walls, sending dust cascading from above. Shouts echoed in a language not their own, fierce and angry. She crouched low behind the barricade, eyes narrowing. Her hands steadied as she pressed the rifle to her shoulder. "Hold," Hale whispered beside her. Torres clenched his jaw, rifle trembling in his grip. Carden muttered something under his breath, a prayer perhaps. She inhaled once deeply, then she let the silence decide. The first wave broke against their defenses, and she moved with precision. Each shot was measured, each silence between them deliberate. Her calm spread like a current, slowing the frantic rush of fear in the others. Torres fired more steadily now, following her rhythm. Carden held his ground. Even Hale fought with sharper focus, his orders clear and steady. The enemy pressed harder, but silence carried heavier than noise. Hours blurred into moments. Smoke filled the air, choking, burning. The outpost shook with impact after impact. At one point, Hale was thrown from the barricade by a near strike. She reached him, pulled him upright with arms that barely had strength left. Their eyes met, his full of grit, hers of quiet resolve. "You should have been leading all along," he rasped. She said nothing. She only pushed him back toward cover and raised her rifle again. By the time the assault waned, the valley was littered with stillness. The enemy had broken again, not by volume, not by firepower, but by the weight of silence they could not match. The outpost still stood, barely, and so did they. Torres slumped against the wall, sweat pouring down his face. "I don't know how the hell we're still breathing." Hale dropped beside him, nodding toward her. "Because of her." Carden said nothing. He only looked at her as though seeing something more than human. But she didn't feel more than human. She felt hollow, drained, as though the silence inside her had carved out everything but resolve. She lowered herself against the cold stone, rifle across her knees once again. The smoke still curled in the air. Her hands still trembled. But her figure remained upright. And in that fragile, unspoken stance, the unit saw proof of something they couldn't name. When dawn came, the valley lay quiet again. Not victory, not defeat, something heavier, something earned. She closed her eyes, let the sun warm her battered skin, and allowed herself one fleeting thought. Maybe silence didn't rewrite destiny by shouting down fate. Maybe it rewrote it simply by refusing to bow. And though she would never say the words aloud, the truth lingered in the stillness. Sometimes silence carried more weight than war itself. Why did she wake with her brother's name on her lips? The outpost was still shrouded in mist, the valley damp with the weight of another night survived. The others were scattered, Hale asleep against the wall, Carden curled in his blanket, Torres packing like a restless wolf. The silence pressed heavy, but inside her chest it thundered. She had dreamed again, not of battles, not of victories, of him, his laugh quiet and rare, his hand ruffling her hair when she was still too small to carry her own rifle, his voice whispering secrets only silence would keep. "Don't ever let them tell you you're too fragile. The world breaks harder things every day." She opened her eyes and stared at the fractured sky. Fragile. That word had followed her for years, spoken in hushed tones by commanders, whispered by fellow recruits, muttered by those who thought her bones too slight for the weight of war. They hadn't seen what silence could forge. He had, until the day he was gone. By noon, the rhythm of survival returned. They scavenged, patched, prepared. Hale studied the maps again, marking enemy routes. Torres argued about rations. Carden coughed blood into his handkerchief but pretended not to notice. She moved among them like a ghost, her rifle slung, her steps soundless. They looked at her now with respect, but also with questions they didn't voice. They had seen her fight, seen her lead, but they hadn't seen the storm inside her. It was Carden, fragile himself, who broke the silence. "You ever lose someone?" he asked quietly when the others were distracted. Her hands stilled. For a moment she considered lying, pretending, but his eyes, tired, sunken, waiting, pulled the truth from her. Yes. Carden nodded slowly, as though he had expected it. Brother. She froze, the word cut like a blade. He didn't wait for her to confirm. He only whispered, "Me too." They sat in silence, two figures bound by loss neither wanted to name. And yet, in that moment, the outpost felt less alone. That night the storm broke again, not thunder, not rain, fire. The enemy returned with vengeance, their fury crashing against the outpost in waves. Mortars lit the sky, machine guns spat fire into the dark. The air screamed with violence. She crouched behind the barricade, her body shaking, not from fear but from memory. The chaos dragged her back to that day. Her brother had stood where she stood now. Fragile frame, steady hands. He had carried silence like armor. And then, one sound too loud, one moment too late. She had watched him fall, watched the silence break. And now she carried what was left. Hale shouted orders, his voice raw. Torres cursed as he fired blindly into the night. Carden's hands shook, his shots clumsy but determined. And her she moved like silence itself, every step deliberate, every shot measured. She wove through the storm as though it were only wind. At one point Hale stumbled, a bullet grazing his shoulder. She pulled him down, pressed her hand to the wound, and whispered, "Breathe." His eyes burned into hers. "How do you stay so calm?" She didn't answer. She couldn't, because inside she wasn't calm. Inside she was screaming her brother's name. Hours blurred. Smoke choked the air, the stench of blood thick. The enemy pressed harder than ever. And then silence. Sudden, unnatural, the gunfire ceased, the shouting faded, the valley held its breath. Hale frowned, panting. Why they stop? No one answered. But she knew. This wasn't retreat. This was a pause, a cruel silence before the next storm. The dawn that followed was the heaviest yet. They were alive, but barely. Hale's shoulder was wrapped in torn cloth. Torres bore a gash down his arm. Carden coughed until his body shook. And she carried the silence. Her frame thinner, her skin pale, her eyes shadowed. Yet she stood, always stood. Hale approached her, his voice low. "You've been holding more than just this outpost." She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon. "My brother," she said quietly, "he was like you, strong, loud when he needed to be, but he believed in silence, taught me everything I know about it." Her throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "He died holding ground like this. No one remembered his name, no one but me." Hale's jaw worked as though searching for words. None came. She finally turned to him, her eyes steady. "That's why I don't break, not because I'm stronger, but because I promised him I wouldn't." For once Hale said nothing. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, firm, grounding. The unit moved slower that day, exhaustion weighing them down. Torres muttered about retreat again, his voice sharper now, edged with desperation. But Carden surprised them all. His voice cracked, but his words were steel. "She's right. If we run, their names mean nothing. Our names mean nothing." Torres fell silent. And so they stayed. That night, as the valley quieted once more, she sat alone by the broken wall. The stars burned cold above her, indifferent to the battles below. She pressed her rifle to her chest and closed her eyes. Her brother's face came to her again, clearer now, not in death but in life. Smiling faintly, his eyes full of the same quiet resolve she carried now. And for the first time since he had fallen, she let herself whisper his name into the silence. Not loudly, not with despair, with reverence. It did not echo. It did not need to. The silence carried it farther than any voice could. When dawn rose, the others found her still sitting there, pale, weary, but upright. And though they didn't hear the name she had whispered, they saw something different in her eyes. Not just silence, but memory. And memory, they realized, could hold the line as surely as walls or weapons. Why did her silence now feel heavier than the rifle strapped to her chest? The convoy crept forward through streets that once echoed with laughter. Now windows were shattered, curtains swayed like ghosts in the wind, and silence pressed down so thick it felt alive. Every soldier around her shifted uneasily, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. They trusted their training, their gear, their orders. But when they glanced at her, at the woman who rarely spoke, something else flickered in their gaze, a question they never dared to ask. What kept her standing so still when the world around them shook? She scanned rooftops, alleys, every flicker of light. The smoke from a distant strike still lingered in the air, its acrid bite crawling into her lungs. Yet her focus didn't waver. Inside, though, her chest tightened. A whisper rose, her brother's voice, the last thing she remembered before his absence carved a hole through her life. Don't let them take your silence. That's the only thing they can't own. The convoy halted, static crackled in the radio, a warning. Her pulse steadied, though her mind raced. They were walking into something. She could feel it, not in words, not in maps or intelligence briefings, but in the tremor of silence around them. The kind of silence that wasn't empty but waiting. The young corporal beside her swallowed hard. "Ma'am," he whispered, voice breaking just enough to betray his fear. "Something's wrong." She didn't answer. She simply raised a hand, her fingers slicing the air with calm precision. Every soldier froze, and in that moment their fear found a quiet anchor. Her silence wasn't absence, it was command. A shadow moved on the rooftop, too quick, too subtle for most eyes, but not hers. She lowered her rifle, exhaled slow, steady, like she had 1,000 times on ranges in forgotten nights in places where no one remembered her name. One squeeze, a flash, the shadow dropped. Gasps erupted from the unit, but she didn't look at them. Her gaze stayed on the smoke, on the streets curling with emptiness, on the weight pressing down. Because she knew this was only the beginning. And deep down, a question gnawed at her. How much longer could she carry the silence before it crushed her too? What does silence sound like when the guns finally stop? The battlefield lay still. Smoke curled in thin ribbons, lifting toward a sky painted in pale dawn. The world had lost its noise, the thunder of artillery, the crack of rifles, the screams swallowed by chaos. What remained was an aching quiet, broken only by the soft crunch of boots stepping carefully among the ruins. And there she was, standing tall, though her uniform was torn, though dust and sweat clung to her skin. The others moved around her, whispering to one another, carrying their wounded, counting the missing. But their eyes, every single one of them, kept drifting back to her. Not because of what she said. She had spoken so little, even now, but because her silence had carried them where words never could. A medic brushed past, mumbling prayers under his breath. The corporal who once doubted her leaned heavily on a rifle, his hands shaking. He glanced at her, eyes glassy, and tried to speak, but no words came. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if confessing something only silence could forgive. She returned the gesture barely, almost invisible, a tilt of the chin, but to him it was everything. Her rifle hung loosely at her side. The weight of it was nothing compared to the burden inside her chest. Names, faces, moments she would never forget. The world would never know them all. Reports would be filed, lines of ink on paper. But what mattered, the fear they fought through, the courage no one saw, would remain unwritten. She thought of her brother then, the promise she had carried like a scar. Don't let them take your silence. It had guided her, broken her, lifted her. And now, standing in the gray light of morning, she realized it had also saved more lives than any weapon she could hold. A breeze stirred, clearing some of the smoke. The horizon stretched wide. There was no cheering, no triumphant music, just breath, just stillness, just the unshakable truth that sometimes survival is victory enough. One of the younger soldiers limped toward her, his face smeared with grime. He whispered, almost afraid to disturb the air, "They'll never write it right. They'll never write what you did." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time in what felt like years her lips parted. But no words came. Instead, she offered him the smallest, most fragile smile, a human smile. And in that silence, he understood. Because history doesn't always live in books or in medals pinned to chests. Sometimes, history lives in the way someone stands unbroken, unspeaking, while the world burns around them. The camera would linger here if this were a film, on her silhouette framed by smoke and light, on the stillness that said more than any speech, on the unshakable truth that destiny isn't rewritten with noise, but with the strength to remain standing when no one else can. The moment stretched, fragile, eternal. And then nothing. Just silence. The kind that doesn't need explanation. The kind that lingers long after the story ends. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.